Most people believe they miss other people directly. A relationship ends, distance appears, someone changes, or someone disappears entirely, and the emotional pain feels focused on the loss of that individual. From the inside, it seems obvious you miss them because they are gone. But psychologically, the experience is more complicated. Relationships do not only connect you to another person, they connect you to specific emotional states, routines of perception, nervous system patterns, expectations, behaviors, and versions of yourself that only existed within that relational environment. Over time, the mind adapts around repeated interactions until the relationship becomes part of the structure through which identity operates. This means that when someone disappears, the loss is not only external, a particular psychological environment collapses with them. The version of you that existed inside that environment loses reinforcement. And because identity depends heavily on repetition and continuity, the disappearance of that reinforcement can feel like losing part of yourself. The pain is therefore not only attachment to the other person, it is attachment to the internal world that existed around them. This is why nostalgia often feels strangely self-focused beneath the surface. You are not simply remembering the person, you are remembering who you were emotionally allowed to become in their presence. The mind then experiences the disappearance of that state as both relational loss and identity disruption simultaneously. What hurts is not only that someone is gone, it is that a psychologically familiar version of yourself stopped being continuously recreated through interaction with them. Relationships quietly shape identity because the nervous system adapts to repeated emotional environments automatically. Around different people, different patterns become reinforced. Certain emotions appear more often, certain behaviors become easier, certain thoughts become more accessible. One relationship may reinforce confidence, another may reinforce anxiety, another may reinforce emotional openness, playfulness, ambition, calmness, hypervigilance, or insecurity. Over time, these repeated relational states stop feeling situational and begin feeling personal. The mind learns how to organize itself predictively around the emotional structure of the relationship. Eventually, the nervous system begins anticipating the emotional world associated with that person before interactions even occur. This creates stable identity states linked directly to relational environments. The important detail is that these states often feel authentic because repetition reduces resistance around them. The version of yourself repeatedly reinforced in the relationship begins feeling natural. The mind then integrates that state into its broader self-concept. But because the state depended partly on ongoing relational reinforcement, the disappearance of the relationship destabilizes the identity structure connected to it. What feels like heartbreak is often partly the nervous system losing a familiar emotional environment it had adapted around deeply enough to mistake for a permanent part of the self. Memory intensifies this process because the past is reconstructed emotionally rather than replayed objectively. When people remember relationships, they rarely recall isolated events neutrally. They reconstruct emotional worlds. The mind retrieves sensory fragments, emotional states, routines, expectations, and identity feelings connected to the relationship and reassembles them into psychologically meaningful experiences. This reconstruction often emphasizes emotional coherence rather than objective accuracy. Certain moments become emotionally amplified because they reinforce the internal version of the relationship the mind stabilized around over time. The person then experiences nostalgia not only toward the other individual, but toward the emotional self reconstructed through memory simultaneously. This is why longing can feel disorientingly self-directed. You may think you are grieving the person, while part of the pain actually comes from briefly reconnecting with a version of yourself that no longer feels accessible in the present. Memory, therefore, becomes a mechanism for temporarily restoring lost identity states. The emotional intensity comes from the contrast between the remembered self and the current one. What hurts is not only absence. It is the realization that certain emotional versions of yourself existed only inside specific relational realities that no longer continue in the same form. The nervous system also becomes attached to predictability inside relationships. Repeated interaction patterns create emotional certainty about how reality will feel around another person. Over time, the brain learns the rhythms of connection, tension, reassurance, distance, humor, affection, or conflict associated with the relationship. These patterns become integrated into daily psychological regulation. The other person stops being experienced only as an external individual and begins functioning as part of the emotional environment itself. This is why separation can feel physically destabilizing even when the relationship was imperfect. The nervous system lost a structure it had adapted around predictively. Familiar emotional rhythms disappear, and the system suddenly loses certainty about how to organize itself internally. What feels like missing the person is often partly the nervous system reacting to disrupted emotional predictability. The absence creates instability because the brain no longer receives the repeated signals it used to regulate expectation, mood, attention, and emotional orientation automatically. The resulting emptiness feels deeply personal because the relationship had become embedded inside the architecture of everyday psychological experience itself. This becomes even more powerful because relationships often function as mirrors through which identity becomes visible. Other people reflect emotional qualities back to you continuously through attention, reaction, validation, conflict, and interpretation. Over time, these reflections shape what parts of yourself feel emotionally real. A person repeatedly seen as capable begins experiencing competence more naturally. A person repeatedly treated as emotionally significant begins experiencing self-worth differently. The nervous system absorbs these relational reflections until they become integrated into identity structures internally. Once this happens, losing the relationship removes not only the external person, but also the consistent reflection system through which certain aspects of self were reinforced. The person may then experience a confusing sense of emotional disappearance. Confidence fades, warmth fades, motivation fades. Emotional openness fades, not because those qualities were fake, but because the relational environment that repeatedly activated and stabilized them no longer exists in the same way. The mind then interprets this absence as missing the other person, while part of the pain actually comes from losing access to emotionally familiar versions of the self that depended partly on relational reinforcement to remain stable. Emotional attachment becomes especially intense when a relationship organizes large portions of daily psychological life. The mind does not separate emotional significance neatly into isolated categories. Relationships influence attention patterns, future expectations, motivation systems, routines, emotional regulation, and even perception of time itself. A person emotionally integrated into everyday life begins functioning as part of the nervous system's predictive structure. The brain anticipates messages, conversations, reactions, shared rituals, emotional reassurance, and familiar interaction rhythms automatically. Over time, these anticipations become embedded into how the mind organizes ordinary experience. When the relationship disappears, the nervous system continues predicting those interactions temporarily because the predictive framework does not collapse immediately. The resulting absence feels emotionally painful not only because the person is gone, but because the brain repeatedly encounters missing expectations throughout daily life. The mind reaches toward familiar emotional structures that no longer resolve in the same way. This creates the sensation that reality itself feels altered after loss, and psychologically it has. The relationship helped shape the structure through which everyday experience was organized. Its disappearance therefore changes the emotional architecture of ordinary life itself. People also become attached to unrealized futures connected to relationships. The mind continuously constructs imagined trajectories around emotionally significant people, future conversations, shared experiences, emotional growth, stability, family structures, reconciliation, or imagined versions of life begin forming psychologically before they exist materially. These imagined futures become emotionally meaningful because the nervous system treats vivid prediction as partially real. Once emotionally integrated, the future itself becomes part of the attachment structure. When the relationship ends, the loss therefore includes more than present connection. Entire projected futures disappear simultaneously. The person grieves not only what happened, but what the mind expected would continue happening. This creates a strange emotional collapse where imagined possibilities feel lost alongside actual experiences. The pain becomes amplified because the nervous system must reorganize around the destruction of predictions it had already partially integrated into identity and emotional expectation. What feels like missing the person often includes grieving futures the mind had already started treating as psychologically real. Idealization strengthens these identity attachments because the mind simplifies emotionally significant people into psychologically concentrated symbols over time. Certain relationships become associated with safety, meaning, validation, possibility, excitement, or emotional escape so strongly that the person themselves begins functioning as a symbolic structure inside the mind. Complexity fades while emotional significance intensifies. The relationship stops representing only interaction with another human being and starts representing access to entire emotional realities. Once this happens, separation feels larger than interpersonal loss. It feels like losing connection to the emotional state the person symbolized internally. This is why some people feel impossible to move on from, even when the relationship itself contained instability, incompatibility, or suffering. The attachment was no longer only about the person objectively. It became attachment to the emotional meaning the mind concentrated around them psychologically. The nervous system then protects the symbolic structure because it stabilizes emotionally important identity states. Letting go begins feeling like abandoning not only the relationship, but also the version of self emotionally organized around its meaning. Time distorts these constructions further because memory selectively preserves emotionally coherent versions of relationships. Contradictions soften, emotional patterns become simplified. Certain moments receive disproportionate significance because they reinforce the internal narrative the mind stabilized around the relationship. Over time, the remembered version may become emotionally stronger than the lived experience itself. The person then begins relating partly to memory rather than to the actual complexity of the former relationship. This is why nostalgia can feel emotionally intoxicating. The nervous system is not reconnecting with reality objectively. It is reconnecting with emotionally refined identity states reconstructed through selective memory. The past begins feeling psychologically cleaner, more emotionally meaningful, and more internally coherent than it was during direct experience. The person then mistakes longing for the reconstructed emotional world as proof they still fundamentally need the relationship itself. But often the mind is attaching more strongly to the emotionally stabilized version preserved internally than to the full reality that originally existed. The reason these losses feel so personal is because relationships partially distribute identity outside the self. Human consciousness does not exist in isolation psychologically. Emotional regulation, self-perception, motivation, meaning, and behavioral patterns continuously interact with external relational systems. Parts of identity become stabilized socially through repeated interaction with specific people over time. This means that losing someone can temporarily destabilize the structure through which the self experiences continuity. The person may suddenly feel unfamiliar to themselves because the relational environment reinforcing certain emotional patterns disappeared. Everyday behaviors change. Emotional responses shift. Motivation alters. Even perception of the world can feel emotionally flatter or more unstable. The loss is therefore not only social, it is structural. A familiar configurity stopped being continuously recreated through interaction. The nervous system then experiences this disruption not simply as sadness, but as partial disorganization of identity itself. This is why people sometimes return repeatedly to relationships they consciously know are unhealthy. The attachment is not always driven purely by love, compatibility, or rational desire. Often the nervous system is seeking reconnection with familiar identity states stabilized inside the relationship. Even painful dynamics can become emotionally organizing if repeated long enough. Chaos may feel familiar, insecurity may feel familiar, intensity may feel familiar. The mind then interprets the pull toward the relationship as proof of emotional necessity, when part of the attraction actually comes from identity familiarity. The relationship restores recognizable emotional structures the nervous system already understands how to navigate predictively. Leaving therefore creates more than loneliness. It creates identity uncertainty. The old relational environment may have caused suffering, but it also stabilized certain versions of the self through repetition. Then prioritizes familiarity over well-being because predictability reduces uncertainty. This is why emotionally destructive relationships can still feel psychologically difficult to release. The system is not only attached to the person, it is attached to the familiar self that existed within the relationship's emotional structure. Healing becomes complicated because people often try to recover by focusing only on the external loss while ignoring the internal identity disruption underneath it. They search for the person emotionally while remaining unaware that part of what they're grieving is the disappearance of a specific psychological world. The mind then keeps returning to memories not only to reconnect with the other person, but to briefly reactivate familiar versions of the self associated with them. This is why healing can feel inconsistent. Some moments feel like longing for the relationship. Other moments feel like longing for a former self no longer accessible in the present. The nervous system is attempting to restore continuity between past and present identity structures, but continuity cannot be recreated through memory alone, because the relational environment that once reinforced those states no longer exists in the same form. Eventually, the system must reorganize around new emotional conditions. This process feels painful because unfamiliar identity states initially lack the emotional certainty repetition once provided. The old self felt emotionally real because it was continuously reinforced. The emerging self feels uncertain because it has not yet stabilized through repetition and lived experience over time. The deeper realization is that relationships are not simply connections between fixed individuals. They are psychological systems that continuously shape perception, emotion, memory, behavior, and identity simultaneously. Every emotionally significant relationship creates a unique internal environment inside which certain versions of the self become more accessible than others. Some relationships narrow identity, others expand it. Some reinforce fear, others reinforce possibility. Over time, the mind adapts around these environments until they become integrated into the structure of lived experience itself. When the relationship changes or disappears, the emotional disruption reflects not only interpersonal separation, but the collapse of a specific psychological reality the nervous system had learned to inhabit repeatedly. What people often describe as missing someone, therefore, contains multiple layers simultaneously. Missing the person, missing the emotional environment, missing the future attached to them, and missing the version of self repeatedly reinforced within that relational world. This realization changes the meaning of nostalgia completely. Nostalgia stops appearing as simple longing for the past and begins appearing as temporary reactivation of previous identity structures preserved emotionally through memory. Certain songs, places, conversations, or photographs feel powerful because they momentarily restore emotional access to former versions of the self. The intensity comes not only from remembering events, but from briefly feeling psychologically reorganized into an older internal state. The nervous system reconnects with patterns of perception, emotional expectation, and identity that once felt continuous and familiar. This is why nostalgia can feel both comforting and painful simultaneously. The remembered self feels emotionally alive again for a moment, but the present self recognizes the impossibility of fully returning to that psychological world permanently. The pain emerges from sensing the distance between who you were inside that environment and who you are now. What feels like longing for people is often partly longing for lost continuity between different versions of yourself across time. The shift begins when you recognize that relationships do not merely add people to your life. They reshape the structure through which you experience yourself. Every emotionally significant connection alters attention, emotional regulation, memory, prediction, identity, and perception in subtle ways over time. This does not make attachment meaningless. It makes it psychologically profound. The people you miss are often intertwined with entire emotional realities the mind built around them gradually through repetition and shared experience. Once this becomes visible, heartbreak stops feeling like simple absence. It begins feeling like the nervous system reorganizing after the collapse of a familiar internal world. And within that realization, a different understanding emerges. The old version of you was never permanently lost inside the other person. It was a psychological state created through interaction, reinforcement, memory, and emotional context, which means new environments, new relationships, and new experiences can eventually construct forms of self that feel equally real again, not because the past disappears, but because identity itself continues adapting wherever the mind repeatedly learns how to emotionally exist.